Well, hi guys. Today we're going to talk about JFK release. We're going to get into some weird topics like Ford, Dulles, Tippet, Biden, Oswald. I mean, it's going to be some fun stuff. Now we're going to bring all kinds of little documents as we go along. We might go long here, guys. You might keep this in the background as you're listening. Some people do that. Like I hear people a lot of time they just kind of keep it in the background, and it's a fun thing kind of to do with that too. Um, so anyway, let's start off here. Hey, Roger, how's it going for you, man?
Hey Scott, I'm doing great. How you doing?
All right. Well,
Good.
better than I was,
Yeah,
So last
good.
week I was sick as a dog and trying to, train two new people. Monday, well, I wasn't there. I was, feeling guilty about it. So, yeah.
But it all worked out, so that's good.
Yeah, it does. My wife kind of took over for most of that, and then I kind of came in later on. So we're really excited about our, new employees and really, good kind of circumstance with that too. So
Very good.
um let's show you the basics, guys. If you're kind of catching this and you never haven't heard what Trump is doing in the background, for years, Trump is a very close friend of the late JFK Jr. Now, obviously, some people believe he's still alive. I'm not going to say yay or nay, and neither is Roger. I mean, he might say something, but the reality is this is a ugly situation for the nation with it too. The key element of this release is where is this part here? That it is a 15-day time frame from the release. So within 15 days of January 13th, Roger, what is that? That's Wednesday. That would be like Thursday, the 23rd. And that would be
I'd be looking around the 28th of January, but we're past that now. So
well,
I
no, I
would
mean
say
15 days from the
15 days, yeah.
23rd. So like, wouldn't that like to be about like February 7th or something like that?
Yes, I'm sorry, yeah, February 7th, that's correct.
Yeah, so somewhere in that range. And by the way, guys, you might be seeing it around February 7th. So, I mean, we could be talking all about that, in the background with that too. Did you find it interesting that they had a separation between, RFK and JFK, or what did you feel like when you saw that?
I wasn't surprised by that. I believe that the reason for the separation is the lion's share of the damning information is going to come out with JFK. That is a process based upon the release of information that's taken place that has built to a crescendo over time. And then, as far as Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, that was just sort of after the fact cleanup, I believe, because this was an ongoing process where the players that were looking to make this happen were involved in a huge amount of planning ahead of time. If you're looking for conspiracy, this is the definition that you would see most often because of the number of people involved in it, the different responsibilities, and how they all played together. So
Right.
no, I wasn't surprised by that.
Now let's do the official story just for the grins of this. Remember, this is November of 63. Um, 6 months before JFK had made a speech to the UN, and he talked about breaking the CIA up into 1,000 pieces. He had fired Dulles, who was the director of the CIA. There was a conversation about the Bay of Pigs wanted to have the CIA flowing into Cuba, and release the hounds in essence, and JFK and RFK pulled back on that area, which infuriated Dulles and his planning. And there's a lot of little things around there. On top of that, he potentially wanted to have Executive Order 1111 or 11110 which is a silver-backed currency, and it's like always fascinating. If you want to do a currency that isn't related to anything other than their fiat currency, they're going to kill you over that kind of thing too.
Yes, they will.
The Warren Commission then was after JFK from the Book School Depository, with the potential, there were several bullets. One of them actually hit underneath the underpass and nicks a guy, as he's underneath there. And then they have the magic bullet that goes into different areas in all kinds of different ways. And some of the theories all were, related to, was there someone on the grassy knoll? Did we, because we have the Zapruder film that came out several years later, was it a kill ratio between several people? But this is one of the very first events where we have, the single man, theory, the lone nut, and then they, with Oswald, and then they, decide to, he is killed by Jack Ruby, who's definite definite relation to the mob, and it does it in camera, which, you're going, you got to be kidding me, response. And basically shuts the door on having a real investigation, which sounds exactly like every single thing, including more recently the Butler event with Trump. The lone gunman is killed. On and on and on. This is how these intelligence agencies do it. I find it fascinating, though, that this is an order by. It's going to be happening through the DNI, which we're right in the middle of these confirmation hearings on two people, Kash Patel, who's definitely seen the files, and Tulsi Gabbard. So anyway, that's the background of that kind of thing. Did you have anything you want to say in the middle of that? Or
Well, the only thing I was going to add is that I was alive during that time period, and I had watched. I missed the assassination, but I watched the replays on it. And I was a youngster at that point, but and the same thing was true. I watched the shooting of Jack Ruby live. I still remember that. And years later, as I look back on some of those things, there were some really weird things that took place. I have had the opportunity to experience people being brought through a police station in handcuffs with law enforcement.
I'm sure.
And I will tell you that the perimeter is so tight that you cannot get close. And so the mere fact that was an open area there demonstrates to me, in later years, that was a setup to ensure that Oswald never made it out of the police department. So that's issue number one. Issue number two, when I look back at some of the different things that come into play, I have never seen a situation where an individual that everybody in the police department knows and knows well is allowed to get into that area with a concealed weapon, even if they carry, because that was another odd thing. And there were just so many of those different things.
Even in '63 in Dallas, where people, guns are very, very out there in essence.
Yes.
And yet, that didn't make any sense either.
And there were just so many other things that, looking in retrospect, if you look at it and kind of dissect the information, a lot of it looks like it was a very poor job at trying to create a cover-up and redirect the blame to someone else who may have been a patsy for the crime, and to sort of clean out the people that could talk about it. In most situations, when you have a conspiracy, they try and clean up afterwards so that people will not talk. Even those folks that may or may not be connected with the mob, they always end up finding a way to silence them or keeping them under closer guard. And I think the same situation took place here with the level of involvement of the three-letter agencies and the politicians and other people that were involved in it. They did a pretty good job of trying to tighten things up.
Right. So over the years, that there were a few points of release. We have the Church Commission 77. Did I say that right?
I think 77, yes.
Okay. And they said there is more than likely probably a conspiracy theory. Now, that's a very interesting, weird statement. That it's like more than likely. And so in audiology, we have patients who come through the door, and if they have a workman's comp case, and you know this very well, you'll get it instantly with this. You cannot say anything is directly related to an event.
Yes.
If that, like, I don't care if an explosion went off beside a person, you can't know how much noise damage that they might have had to their ears beforehand. But you have to use these words called, it's more than likely than not that the event occurred and it affected X. And that's exactly how the Church Commission put it at the end. I think it's pretty darn fascinating. It follows up with the 92, another kind of round that they did in Congress and Senate. And then I think it's who does the JFK movie?
Oliver Stone.
Oliver Stone does his movie, which pushes the envelope even further until they decide that they have to release the files in 2017. And then in 2017, Trump is trying to release the files. But I think it's a fascinating thing, and this is very related, is Pompeo, the Secretary of State at the time frame, saw the files, and he told Trump that it was not a good idea to release it then. And by the way, just the other day, Pompeo lost his security apparatus and his security clearance. So, like, you're going, is that related?
I would say more likely than not, it's related.
Oh my gosh, there you go.
And again, the reason I say this, if you look historically back at this, there were a number of Americans, a number of people in the public who said, look, we should have this information released because we have a right to know.
Right.
And the government comes along and says, well, not really, you don't have a right to know, because more likely than not, what you see is going to cause disruption. It's going to lead to some other event that's going to create bigger problems for the country. So they've used that justification for keeping things hidden. And what it does, I think, beknownst or unbeknownst to the people that are trying to keep it hidden, it just stimulates people who are going to deep dive into what they have. They're going to go talk to people. They're going to interview people. They're going to try and get a sense of where things are. They're going to start asking questions. They're going to look for reasonable answers to those questions. And as they start to sew it together, they're going to realize that, yes, this was a conspiracy. Number two, there was a cover-up. And number three, most of the people that are involved in doing it were either silenced or have since died. And so they're getting to the point where eventually they have to release this information. And then what you have is that group of people who come to that conclusion that are being challenged by those who say, well, that's in the past, it's history, there's no need to look at it because we don't need to disrupt the apple cart. So that's the kind of balance that's taking place now.
Well, and I think it's fascinating because, 1992, that was my wake up event. Most people who know me, and Roger knows me too, but the point is that I tend to deep dive anything. If I'm going to get into a conversation, an event, and I have like something written down here. I was in Matthew 24, and I'm like, okay, I better deep dive on that one. And I'll spend a lot of time pushing on an issue. And that was something that I grew up doing. And Kennedy was the thing I deep dove over and over again, especially when I went back to the Bookstore Depository so many times. And they would give you, like this much space of the whole museum for the conspiracy theory. And now, more recently, and I think it was around the same time of 2017, the last time I was there or so, Um, they had, I mean, they admit, I mean, like 30 or 40% of the museum is on the conspiracy theory, because the reality is 65 or so percent of Americans do not believe the official story. And that's pretty powerful. Um, you know, I mean, what are the basic implications if the story that we all look at, what are the basic implications uh, that could happen if their official story is really torn down, in essence?
I think the biggest thing that you would expect, and again, this is my perspective on this, based on how I've watched things, seen things unfold, and even participated in things and stepped back before they went off the track. The biggest fear is that the people in control will lose control. And so, for example, if the public begins to judge the validity of the arguments set forth and the statements that people made, and they come to the realization that they were false, they were manipulated, they're hiding the truth from the American people, that causes the American people to lose faith in their leaders. And I
Right.
believe that the biggest fear that they were concerned about is that if this gets out, it's going to demonstrate to the public that they never could trust those they put in office. Number one. Number two, the power really rested with money, political figures, and I'll say it, lawyers and judges who are manipulating the process and using it to their benefit or to the benefit of someone else. Now, it's very possible that the people who were involved in creating the conspiracy and leading the conspiracy were being controlled by an even higher element
Oh,
that
sure.
nobody's aware of.
Sure.
But by and large, if you look at all the characters that came together for meetings about the assassination and the pre-planning that's taken place, and there's a lot of credible information out there of interviews and people who were watching this and other people who wanted to get something off their conscience before they died, and they talked about the different things that took place. This was something that took a period of time to put together. But again, you had some people that were very dominant leaders that were pushing the issue. And one of the things that was a tip-off that I just learned recently was that in the history of the United States Senate, we have never had a majority leader who sits on the Appropriations Committee for an agency until Lyndon Johnson come along.
Oh,
He,
that's right.
he
Okay.
became
I get
majority leader, then he got himself appointed to the Appropriations Committee that oversees funding for the CIA. That
Huh.
meant that he had connections with all the people in the CIA and could begin to develop that relationship for whatever future purpose might be there. And so it's important to dive into the things and start making connections with the different people that are connected with this and how it goes forward. Because once you have those relationships, there are a lot of what I would refer to as off books, off the record conversations that take place. I
Right.
mean, if you know the director of the CIA personally, you can stand on the street. You can figure out some way to make contact with them and have a conversation with them, either at a mutual event that you might go to, or just intentionally bumping into them on a Saturday morning because you know what their behavior is, and you can develop that relationship and begin to plant some of those seeds for moving forward. And I think that was one of the biggest realizations that I learned in this process about how strongly implicated Lyndon Johnson was in this whole activity. And then as
Well,
he got towards
that's
the end,
exactly what Roger Stone said too. I
yes,
mean, he was the top of the pyramid in
yes,
essence, and that's
and,
where you're going as well. And
yes. And as people get to the end of their lives, they want to get this off their conscience. They feel the need to let people know,
oh yeah, right.
and so and they all do it.
Yeah,
So
and he had a very guilty response to a lot of it. Even his you know, when he is pushing some of the racial stuff in a good way. I mean, in the later 60s, you know, he's you know, opening it up and allowing it. You just felt there was a guilty conscience that kept coming forth on him, and everything he did. And then, you know, he was disgusted by the whole system. And by the way, so was Nixon. So were a lot of these people when you kind of, when you see them near the end of their life.
Yes.
I mean, they were very disgusted by the systems because, and including one of a very interesting one is Woodrow Wilson. Even though he was very, very sick and not well, in his later years, who obviously started the Fed and was basically hired by the cabal to start the Fed. He hated that he had done that, and that's a pretty common theme through these guys.
Well, and I think the other thing that's important for people to realize is that when you get to the seats of power, that there is a good likelihood that you're faced with the choice of corruption or walking away. And if the desire to be successful and to get involved is more important than the willingness to walk away and live another day, then you essentially, from my perspective, you sell your soul. And
Right.
you sell your soul initially to the people that are trying to purchase it. And then from that point on, it goes to the highest bidder. And you find yourself in a situation where you will do what you are requested to do. And it's not really a request. It's, look, okay, you do it this way or else. And then, and that's gone on in this country for a long period of time.
Right.
And the reason I say that is that if you look at the how power flows up to the power points in this country, whether it be your capitals, Washington, D.C., your larger cities that have corporations there, the role people play in the corporations. If you want to make it up and be successful, you're always faced with that decision. Do I play this game
Absolutely.
and risk losing my soul, or do I play something different to preserve my soul? And that's why a lot of people, when they get to the end of their lives, they're faced with this dilemma. If I clear my conscience, do I help my soul?
Yeah.
A lot of them believe if they do that, there's sort of a soul cleansing process that they go through. But for many of them, the level of involvement that they've been in and the resultant injuries and harm to other people is so great that I don't believe that they're able to be as successful with that soul cleansing process as they want to.
Well, yeah, and whether you always have to ask the question: how much do you really want to do this? If someone really wanted to do this, come back from that darkness, there always is a possibility for someone to become a believer at the end. I'm not going to put that in there as well. But there is so much deception that goes on. It's very hard for them to get to that, that final point of what would I really have to give up, to share this information or to know it. And not one of them really went that far.
No, they didn't. And the reason I say that you get to the point of where you may not be able to, I'm not talking about my perspective.
Oh, sure.
Or anyone else's perspective. It's just that the level of harm that was done and the reverberations or the impact on other people that have taken place is so great that you just can't possibly undo it. I take, for example, a look at the Depression. The number of people who lost their lives, families destroyed, organizations that were ripped apart. I mean, how that changed this country. And there were people at the very top who were successful and made it through it without a problem. And yet everybody else that went through the suffering, you can't restore their lives to that pre-suffering period because they've lost too much, especially if there's been death or permanent injury or permanent loss of families. So there comes a point in time where you try to rationalize that you're coming clean and helping, but that never happens. And I think part of that issue is what happened with LBJ and the people that were involved in the assassinations that took place in the 60s. Their ultimate goal was to come out on top.
Right.
And the result was they destroyed so many lives and they destroyed so many elements in this country that it was very hard to come back from. And then as other people come along, they got sucked into the process of being told, okay, we got you into this point. I mean, I think of when LBJ was trying to put together the Warren Commission report. Someone like Gerald Ford stands off to the side. He doesn't want to do it. Warren doesn't really want to do it. And then, LBJ kind of looks at him and says, you got to do it.
Right.
And so they're in for it because they know that someone has compromised their integrity and their involvement in things. So now they're sort of forced into creating another layer of the cover up.
Well, and Dulles, by the way, too, focused all of his energy. He didn't even take back the CIA position until after the Warren Commission was done, so that he could focus all of his energy upon it. I mean, he was there for every single one of the hearings, and he would bully the people through. And I mean, it was a shoddy response, a big old thick book with a
Yes.
shoddy response of everything with that too. So let's show this one here now. Obviously, in 2017, they released 50 or 60% of the documents, whatever people might say on that number, but they didn't release a lot. And this is an example that Tucker talked to a guy who definitely believes in the conspiracy point here. So we'll show this one.
The whole thing's a joke. Okay, it's that simple.
But is it legal to criticize the CIA still?
Well, that's what this document, it raises the question, right? If somebody knows the contents of that censored page and came to me and said, Jeff, I'll tell you what's in there, under the law right now, they would be taking a certain legal risk. But that's a fact. And when a JFK whistleblower approached me a couple of years ago, and I wrote about this on JFK Facts last year, he described to me a secret CIA facility in Northern Virginia where he had worked as a contractor. And he said, there's a JFK archive in there. He had seen it. He had talked to the woman who ran it, who controlled access to it. He saw what was on the shelves there. So, that guy, it was risky for him to talk to me. And it took a long time for me to convince him to come forward. And he only came forward after a couple of years when he realized nothing was happening. There was no prospect of the CIA coming clean. So that's important. I'll tell you something else that's good about President Trump's order. I think it makes it easier for any whistleblowers to come forward. And I'd like to say, if there are people out there who have access to classified information, consult your lawyer. But I think President Trump's order effectively, it reduces their risk about talking about things that are classified, because the president's saying, we want all of this out. That carries some weight.
So what's your response to that kind of thing there?
Well, I think that number one, it does carry weight. Number two, I think there will be a release of the information. But again, I'm not certain that all of the information comes out. And the reason I say I'm not certain, because with most of these activities that take place, there is still additional information that people in a position of need to know only might have. And, one of the things I always tell people about when I have conversations with them is I say, okay, think about this. If we're going to have the conversation, number one, you don't record it unless you want the public to know it. Number two, you don't put it in writing of any type, because again, there is an opportunity to collect those documents. So you have what people store in their heads, in their mind, if you will, about personal interactions. Those types of things will never come out unless somebody put them to paper or committed them to a recording, something like that. So that's why I say there's some of this still floating around in the background that we will probably never be privy to. But I think the vast majority of it that comes out will be the documentation that was collected and gathered so the CIA had a record. Because one of the things I believe happens all of the time with these situations is that everyone wants something in writing to protect themselves.
Right.
To protect the agency, to protect the people that are involved in it, because they don't want someone coming out squealing on them, if you will, or talking to the public about something without them having some justification and background to challenge their position. And if there's ever litigation, the same thing is true.
I mean, I totally agree with you there. So, and that's a very common kind of response, but because, well, let me put it this way. What you're saying is that we're never really going to know all of the intents of the people because we're 62 years away from the moment. Because most of those people died. And even if they were alive at this moment, they don't want to tell you what the intents of their heart is. I mean, there's a real interesting scripture of Hebrews 4:12, and it talks about how the word can understand the intents and thoughts of the heart. And we're never really going to know all of those deep intent points, and that's what you're in essence talking about here.
Yes, and I mean, for example, so there's been some discussion out there that Lyndon Johnson's position in wanting to take out JFK was because of the way he was treated as a vice president.
Sure.
But the friction between the two of them go back to the late 50s when they were in the Senate together. So was there something else that may have taken place in the Senate? Was it because of the censuring of Joe McCarthy, where Kennedy voted against that Lyndon was so upset about? It's hard to say because there's other factors that might come into play. When you have,
well, it doesn't. I mean, but I think the big issue is LBJ was. I think that the easiest one that we can realize too is some of those areas are absolutely true, but LBJ was the senior statesman in essence, and that's what really pissed him off in this whole process. Is the younger one jumps up ahead of LBJ, and he always felt it should have been him.
yes, it goes back to, okay, do you pay your dues? Who gets the next shot? The person who paid their dues or the person who's new to the process? And political parties work on dues paying. The next in line is the one who's paid their dues. And the Democrat Party allowed JFK to jump past LBJ. And I believe that was probably the largest reason why he wanted him out of the way, because he knew if he was out of the way, then LBJ would have the opportunity. I believe LBJ thought if JFK was out of the way, he would have the opportunity to leave his imprint on American society as the elder statesman. And I also believe that he saw the threat of RFK and Martin Luther King as tarnishing his ability to achieve things.
Correct.
And there were different signals along the way. I mean, he manipulated RFK to get the wiretaps on MLK. And then when he found out that MLK was going to support RFK in the primary, then, he had to be done away with. So they continue to work through the process. And when you have this conspiracy, and when I say conspiracy, by definition, a conspiracy is when two or more people get together and they begin to formulate a plan to undertake an action, most often illegal, that will result in harm or danger to someone else. And so in this situation, because of the number of people that were involved, and again, you go back to LBJ's staff when he was in the Senate, some of them got moved out of the way. Bobby Baker got moved out because of his illicit behavior, but you got Billy Solestis and some of the others that were there that would do whatever LBJ wanted him to. And if they were told by LBJ to go take someone's life out, they would do it.
Right.
The same was true with that relationship that he had with the CIA, because he said, I got you money in the 50s and 60s to build that organization into a powerhouse. Now you're going to follow my direction and do what I believe has to be done to help elevate me. So from my perspective, that makes perfect sense, because many times that's how government works. That's how people who influence government, political leaders and others, influence an outcome that they want. Many can do it without getting their hands dirty.
Well, I mean,
many of them get their hands dirty and get in trouble.
Well, I always go back to one of the more original points is the concept of the phraseology of conspiracy theory comes because the Warren Commission couldn't plug up all the holes. So the CIA put a disinformation series along with, at the same time, the Project Mockingbird to through the media and through the education department too.
Yes.
To put the concept out there that a conspiracy theory is a really bad thing and you're stupid for bringing it up. And it's one of the more ridiculous points. And it also focused different levels of authority figures. This is where authority figures became more primary than the logic. And I always go back to this. Logic works. I don't care who you are, as my old professor, would say, would the logic matter if I was a garbage man? And I think that we skip that point because we go, what ability do you have to bring this forward? And if you don't have an ability to bring it forward, then you shouldn't be able to bring it forward because you don't have any authority to that. And that is a real piss poor way of looking at it, as opposed to, because it's an authority based, as opposed to just the pure logic of it. And I think that we never sit down as Americans and really sit down and say, is there a possibility of that?
Well, I would agree with that. And I think the other part of it is, as Americans, we have been trained, if you will, indoctrinated, if you will, to believe that we are to take for granted that everything we are told, everything we are shown is the absolute truth. And
Right.
we tend to rely on people that we perceive as being good authorities in an area to be truthful and honest. And no one ever wants to follow the science or follow the logic or understand what's taking place. And then when you add to that, who was the one that's actually forwarding the argument? Is that argument being forwarded by someone in a position of authority, or is it someone who's challenging the authority? Because if you're challenging the authority, you're going to be diminished outright. It's not having the ability to do that because, after all, you're not an authority figure. And they never give a valid reason why the logic of everyday Americans has to be dismissed, other than the fact that they're just everyday Americans and not leaders. And I think that's the great danger that we have faced. We're learning up to this point in time that we have tens of thousands, millions of people out there who could very easily step into and be an authority figure because of the level of knowledge they have and the logic they use to bring information to the public. They've just never been given a chance. And with alternative media out there today, which is not really my favorite name for it, but it's the alternative voices that are out there, they have more logic than a lot of the leaders that we've relied on in the media, in government, in business, and elsewhere over the past 6 decades.
Right. And it's pretty darn fascinating. Now I'm gonna adjust us a little, and I'm gonna show you a perception that I've had. Now, I cannot prove this. I don't know if I believe it yet or not. I will just, pop it out there as an interesting point here, and we'll see what Roger says on this one point. The picture that was on the Life magazine here is on the left-hand corner. This is Oswald. This is the Carcano rifle. He has a newspaper in front of him, and the newspaper was talking about the date. None of the way that this happens, the way that the shadows hit, and every single photography expert would tell you none of that thing fits. I mean, his head was definitely superimposed upon there. And there's an interesting person that looks very much like him here, and I think it's pretty darn fascinating, the possibility of Biden. And this is an actual document that was delivered in that statement. And let's say who said this here. And it was stated in 1994 by John F. K. Jr. Okay, so JFK Jr. stated this, and he said, "Dear Senator Biden, you are a traitor." And I find that one of the more fascinating little documents out there, because one of the key elements I find with the tracking Oswald, while he's definitely involved in the planning and execution, some level of it. I mean, he's definitely not innocent. But he would be maybe a conspiracy to commit kind of possibility. But there were people who had him going up a stairway. I mean, running up or running down a stairway, and the other people said that he was standing by a Coke machine. And in the Officer Tippet event that we'll get into here in a minute, he's running down an area, but he wasn't really there. And, all of the timing of the events don't really match up here. And we do know that there were many little Oswalds running around. And is it possible? And is it even a little bit possible? Because, Biden's nearly the same age as Oswald was. Is it possible at all that Biden, this was his initialization of what he could have done? And to me, what a fascinating concept. This is Scott saying it here, so don't, I'm not 100% on that thing, but what if Biden was allowed to be the president for this time frame, to as his cabal reward for this initialization of point? Do you want to throw your own 2 cents in there, or totally dissuade everything that I said?
Sure. Okay, first of all, I don't disagree with the theory or with the premise of it, because if you go back and look retrospectively at what's going on in our country, the more you become enlightened about some of the different things that have taken place in our country, the more you come to the realization that those who have essentially made a deal with the devil, if you will, eventually reap their reward. And you can go back over the history of Joe Biden and look at all the different things he did, back through and including I would go back so far as to include the death of his first wife and his daughter. I would go back to the first time he ran for the Senate in Delaware. If you take a look at all the different things that he stood for down through the years, they were all part of the process of doing what he was told to do. There was never a bigger supporter of Robert Byrd, the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, than Joe Biden was.
Correct.
Joe Biden, there's evidence in the past of him parading around again in white sheets and doing things that brought harm to African Americans in this country. And the Democrat Party and the deep state did a fairly effective job of painting him as a true soldier for racial equality in this country, and he was just the opposite. He did what he was told to do, and I believe that his reward for, at the time, his apparent legacy was to be given the opportunity to be president.
Right.
And that was a payback for all the things in the past that he was involved in doing. If you go back in the very beginning and take a look at some of the discussions that take place, and this is one of the reasons why the congressional record is such a good piece to research. If you look at the congressional record, there's speeches of all types that are made by senators. Now, the problem that you run into, senators and members of Congress, but the problem you run into is whenever someone says, I reserve the right to revise and extend my remarks, that tells you that they're going to manipulate what they said and actually put something different in the record than what they said or what they did.
Right.
And it may even be to the point of where they say, well, I was there on that day, when in fact they showed up absent for the role. But they got it in there to demonstrate the fact that they are participating in a process here that is trying to get the American public to believe certain things happened and took place. So yes, I do believe that your theory is plausible. I believe there's ample evidence in the past to demonstrate that he was rewarded for the things he did and for his behavior, just like so many others were. And I would put the vast majority of the presidents in that position, going all the way back to LBJ and before. If you play on the team and do what's right, you get rewarded.
Well, let's prove some of that too. We'll skip over this one here. We'll skip out that one. We also have Poppy Bush, that is got a very curious, history. One of the points of his history, as well as being in World War II, was he a pilot? Isn't that right?
He was a pilot, yes.
Okay. And just now, while JFK was a not a tugboat,
PT boat operator.
PT boat operator with that too. So he was a captain. Poppy, a very big, was a war hero as well. But he suddenly at this time frame is working in an oil, Zapata oil, actually at the time frame in Texas. And then he's suddenly working a little for the CIA, and I could not find the document here. I wish I could, but the document stipulated from J. Edgar Hoover that George W. Bush, or he says George Bush was at Dallas when Kennedy was killed. Why I bring this up here, and I will add all these little documents. You guys can go research them. I'll put them in the description here. But both Barbara and Poppy used were two people who couldn't tell you where they were at the JFK event. And their little statements change a little bit. And she even says, even says, his hazy response becomes an issue a quarter century after the assassination. And the reality is, like, no one, and you might say, well, how is that a big deal if you're more of an X generation or a Y generation? If you're an X generation, the moment in time that you saw 9/11. I mean, I wasn't born at JFK kind of thing, okay? But I know for a fact where I was the moment that I saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center. I knew what I was doing. I could tell you all the little details of that. And for someone and anyone whatsoever, the two of these people didn't know where they were in that thing, which is fascinating because here's a potential picture that is a portion of the Dealey Plaza. And this, actually, they talk about this in the Dealey Plaza museum there, that, here's a potential of Poppy outside of the book school depository with that too. And here's is that other potential reward with that too?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about this, actually, there's a couple of them. If you look at the fact that at that time he worked for an oil company, and the company he worked for at that time owned the Texas School Book Depository.
Right.
And so there's that linkage there, number one. Number two, he was very heavily involved in serving as a lobbyist, if you will, or an influencer to try and make certain that oil companies did not be taxed for, at the time, depletion of the product of oil from the ground. And so he was trying to protect the interests of the oil company. The second thing that I thought was interesting is that because of his prior history in the military, and I'm not going to mention his dad at that point, Prescott Bush, but because of his prior involvement in the military, he had connections with people in the military with him that actually worked for the CIA. Right. So it was very, very much possible for him to actually have been on the CIA payroll based on what he was doing, how he was dealing with things, and
some level of informant.
Level of informant, yes.
Right. Right.
And then you add the fact that Prescott Bush, his father, was heavily involved in the Americans who were supporting Adolf Hitler. Sure. And providing supplies to Adolf Hitler during World War II and manipulating what was taking place with regard to the banking and financial structure of Europe during World War II. I mean, he's really kind of tied into that more so than what they claim their memory provides. But the reality is that there are other types of activities around there on a deep dive that would demonstrate that he was more than likely not involved in the planning and the actual undertaking of the assassination. Yeah, and may very well have been one of the people planner on the grassy knoll or standing around someplace, because there are some pictures that show someone who could be him. But the image is not that good. So yes, I mean, I would agree with what you stated earlier, that you offer a statement of uncertainty over what you were doing as a means to deflect.
And here's the point. I mean, and let me take you down another couple rabbit hole points that I would say too. So Ford, President Ford, who was just a congressman at the time, was, on the Warren Commission. Okay, got it. We have a potential of Joey, who is later senator, vice president, then president, and has very strange responses with JFK Jr. Okay, got it. Poppy Bush is said, I mean, outed by J. Edgar Hoover that he was in Dallas at the same time frame. That's funny because the CIA actually had another person named George Bush who was there, who was in the CIA's role, but wasn't the same George Bush. They actually had him for about a 2-year period of time, and then he was let go. It's fascinating. It's just their way of deniability with this too. We have and let me throw out an even weirder circumstance that most people haven't really paid attention to. Go backward in time, and Prescott Bush had actually hired Richard Nixon to be, and was an actor and a World War II veteran, was an actor, and brought him along so that he could be one of those candidates against his son in 1960. So you have the man who helped him become a at least a candidate for president in 1960, and the father of the president at that time frame. So one guy is pulling the strings on both areas, on top of Prescott had pushed the mob to get JFK elected in a very tight race in Chicago, that the mob kind of pulled the strings with this too. Or we would have had Nixon in office instead of JFK with that too. And so in a very short moment in time, for around the JFK, the JFK issues, we have LBJ, JFK, we have Poppy Bush, we have Joe Biden, and President Ford. 5 presidents who are in and around a one event. And so if I were sitting in a court of law, if I was, standing on this, I'd be throwing out these little things, maybe as and maybe someone says, well, the circumstantial evidence. I'm like going, that's fine. You have enough circumstantial evidence, but you need to answer the point here. I mean, shoot me down with the real evidence, and that's never been done.
No, it hasn't. And I think one of the other things, Richard Nixon was on, he was the VP for Dwight Eisenhower in 1956.
Right.
Brought on the ballot in 57, 56. And he was being groomed to run against JFK. And Prescott Bush was very heavily involved in that. And his son, H.W., his son-in-law, his son was heavily involved with other members of the Bush family, the Eisenhower family, the Nixon family, trying to bring about this whole process. And the interesting thing is that at that time you had the mob who was really beginning to exercise their influence in Vegas and in some of the large cities in the U.S. Right. And so they crossed paths with a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans. And the goal at the time was who was going to exercise the greatest degree of influence. And it was my understanding that the reason that Chicago went down the way it was that the mob was involved in throwing the election with Richard Daley, because they were in a position where Kennedy Sr., Joseph P. Kennedy, had made a promise to the mob that if his son was elected, that they would not investigate him and they would not chase him out of the country. So there was that type of thing that was going on. And that was even after you had the primary situation in West Virginia that took place that year, where Kennedy almost lost the primary. And so, you had a lot of manipulation that went on in the process here, with people trying to exercise influence and manipulate people long before the American public was paying attention to it.
Yeah, and Bobby, then Bobby, Kennedy pushed the mob over and over again after they were in office, as he is the AG, and he pushed the mob and pissed them off too. So
Yeah.
you have a confluence of a whole load of people that.
Well, and can I stop you there a minute, Scott? Also,
Yeah.
at that time period, you had the Cuban overthrow,
Oh,
where
sure.
the mob was really big in Cuba. So they got chased out of Cuba by Fidel Castro. And so there
Yep.
was a situation where they were looking at trying to get back what they had lost. And so they were beginning to exercise their influence politically for both political parties. And it was whoever was going to allow them to achieve what needed to be done was going to be on their side. And so I think one of the other things too that's important to look at with this is that at that point in time, we had the confluence of politicians, of lawyers, of judges, the mob, business, labor unions. At that point in time, Jimmy Hoffa was coming into sway. So you had the labor unions playing a role in this. You had Bobby Baker, who was basically Lyndon Johnson's bag man, who was paying people off to do things he wanted to do. So you had a lot of activity going on in this country around the time that those things took place. And then you had J. Edgar Hoover trying to continue to grow and increase the FBI and the involvement that they had, and they were pulling in the CIA to help with that, and any other kind of agency within the Department of Justice that might make a difference by either charging or not charging people. And to top it off, they were also continuing with the mob hearings in the late 50s to try and identify, running parallel with Joseph McCarthy, trying to identify how they could get all of this evil behavior out of the government. And in reality, it was just increasing the level of evil behavior in the government.
Well, I mean,
to demonstrate to the public they were trying to do something when in fact they intentionally set it up as a failure.
Of course they did. And I mean, we only have to go back in, I mean, not even 15, 20 years before ish of 1963 that we have Myers Linsky, who is a mob boss that was the in for the pre-CIA people and the government to get into Italy so that we could invade Italy as well during World War II. I mean, the connection of the mob to the government is super easy to do. It doesn't take a lot of effort, with that. And so we just keep throwing fire out there, and they just can't step on the fire fast enough with it too. There's a document I'll leave on the thing that talks about the IG report related to Oswald and related to Bush, who is potentially involved, and they really don't answer the questions with that too. I want to shift a little bit to Officer Tippet. Do you want to take over Officer Tippet and kind of explain the story and what the potential is of him?
Yes, originally the belief was that Officer Tippet was just a street cop doing his job, responding to the information that they had an all points bulletin out to arrest someone who they gave a description as Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't think at that point in time they knew who he was. They just said that he was in this area and he was in pursuit. He was being pursued by law enforcement, and so they asked officers nearby to be able to pursue it. He saw someone that he believed looked like Oswald, and he went into the movie theater to try and track him down. And at that point, he was actually killed. Now, if you move forward and look at what took place there, originally they said it was Lee Harvey Oswald that killed him. But in fact, it was actually someone who was part of the conspiracy that took his life. And the reason that they took his life was because they made a determination that they needed someone who looked like the president, just in case something happened. I mean, when you've got, and later it was determined that there was as many as 8 to 16 people firing shots, most of whom missed. They had no idea how badly damaged the president's body was going to be. So they had to have another body that they could substitute in the event that things went sideways. And so,
which is the potential for the Walter Reed, event where
Yes.
they were at Walter Reed and the coroners are are trying to do this, and they were under. These people didn't have a clue what they were doing for the most part. They were not skilled at their job and were getting screamed at by generals and CIA and other agencies to do it. And were they really working on Tippet, or were they really working on JFK?
Yes, and again, the rationale that came out later. I mean, I'm talking about 4 or 5 decades afterwards. The reason that Tippet was picked was because of his close resemblance to JFK: height, facial structure, appearance, hair, everything else. So in the event that they had to replace a body, then this was the perfect match for it. And what's even stranger about this is that because of the damage that was done to the president's head, they had to pull in a funeral director who has, again, experience in facial reconstruction. And if you take a look at the damage that's done to someone because of shotgun blasts or high-powered rifle blasts, you can even see it from some of the Zapruder film, where the shots to Kennedy's head from his neck on up appear to show the fact that his skull was shattered.
Right.
And so, in order to again go back to the theory that this was a magic bullet that could do all different kinds of things that they had decided ahead of time they might need to rely on, they needed someone that they could substitute that would be able to advance their story. So
Right.
unfortunately, J.D. Tippett became a disposable person who was used to substitute for the president in the event that there was going to be a need for further examination once the body got back to D.C. And
Well, I mean,
the goal was to have the funeral director participate that and do what had to be done.
I mean, and this one is one of my more recent discoveries. This was only probably about 2 to 4 years ago that I kind of came across this understanding, and I was like, "What? You've got to be kidding me!" I mean, Tippett was actually known by his friends as a model of JFK, and I mean, his friends called it that. So we have these events. Now I'm going to just wrap it here with this too, and we'll show you a couple of videos here. We have the events on the overall area. We have the possibility of Joe here as a possibility for replacement for Oswald in some level. That JFK Jr. says that he's a traitor. Okay. We have Poppy Bush, who doesn't know where he was during that day, and neither does his wife, who were, in different places, but they can't tell you what they were. They wrote down their events, and it was very inconsistent. That, Poppy Bush is a portion of the group that owns the Book School Depository and has plenty of events. He was outed by, J. Edgar Hoover as being there in Dallas at that day. We have the reality of Nixon, and that he was he was a part of getting JFK in office, but was also connected to Prescott Bush. We also see that Bush doesn't really know where he was, and they didn't really investigate it very well, along with the Tippet issues with that too. And so, I mean, we have all these events, and again, I've got too much circumstantial evidence that needs to get answered here. And yet I always kind of think about this, and I'm going to use a little funny video here. I'm not trying to be over funny here, but the world just goes, I don't want to do this. I don't want to go back for it, because they kind of feel like this here.
1, 2, Freddie Pie! ¿Cómo se llama? No, Kelly Clarkson! I hate you!
I mean, I just think that, we got this event of like, I don't want to go through this. This is not fun. This is not, this is not my desire. And yet, do we really have to do this? And I think that's where we kind of, we have to circle back and go, no, we really do have to do this. I'm going to play this video, and then I really would like you to kind of lead us out as we, kind of look at this, because I found this interesting. It was related to the Kennedy stuff, but only a little bit. So I'll let you guys kind of see what you think about this one.
Look, if you want trust in institutions, and I definitely do, I do. I grew up trusting institutions. I don't now. That's their fault, not mine. I think your country doesn't work if nobody trusts any of the institutions, right? It just doesn't. So we want that. The only way to that is through transparency, honesty. Like the only way to stop disclosure at this point would be with like a catastrophe that's so all-encompassing, 9/11, COVID, that it just, everything shuts down. All trends in progress stop.
Yeah.
And I just feel like there's a lot at stake for these people. If you're, John Brennan or Jim Clapper and you're like a criminal, or Mike Pompeo, you're a criminal. That's my opinion, but I think they're obviously criminals. You've got a lot to lose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people in the intelligence agencies whose names are not known to the public, they're about to be.
This was my thinking about, the period between the election and the inauguration this week. I think that's one of the reasons that Tony Blinken was pushing so hard for a real war, trying to kill Putin, for example, which the Biden administration did. They tried to kill Putin.
Absolutely.
So why were they? Because chaos is a screen that protects them. I mean, I don't know this. That's just like watching what they're doing. I'm like, why would they be doing that? Part of it is because like it's like when you're taking off the roof of the embassy in Saigon, you burn all the papers, right?
Absolutely. They were fiddling with regime change in the interim.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that was a fear that a lot of people had. I didn't think that, frankly, that Trump would become president. I thought for a variety of different reasons, I don't know exactly what could have happened to stop that. But it was hard for me to accept that it did happen.
I was sitting
first.
about 6 feet away, and I just thought, wow, I can't believe this is actually happening.
Right.
But I guess the point I would make is it's like the process has not unfolded fully yet.
To completely control the flow of information, what people see, what people don't see, that they can punish people who step out of line. And we were, this far away from being part of something like that. And if they were going to do that, if they had done that, and I think there was probably some thinking that would have been accomplished by 2024. If you go back and look at some of the European Union's papers on the subject, they were anticipating that we were going to be signatories to certain agreements, like the Code of Practice on Disinformation, that we would have our own version by now. If they had done that, then none of this would be possible. All these independent outlets, they could scream to high heavens, but no one would see it.
So I as we leave here, and I'll let Roger have the final word on here. I'll look at that one, that little snippet there from Tucker and Matt Taibbi. It was pretty darn fascinating. A lot of us expected fireworks anywhere from January 6th to January 20th, and they didn't do it. And so that, a lot of people have kind of given up the steam. Okay, Trump's going to make everything better. And I'm going, hold on, guys. You cannot move forward until we fix some of this stuff too. So let you kind of respond in there.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think that there's two overlying items that we need to remember. In order for us to understand history properly, we need to understand the correct history. So this is a time period where we owe it to future generations to make certain that we correctly write history. So that requires a lot of unpacking and a whole variety of different things that have taken place over, I'll say, the past 150 years. So we have to go through and take a deep dive to see once what took place and make certain we have a good and proper history of the United States. And what that good and proper history of the United States does is it demonstrates to the world that it was the government who created the mistrust, deception, and harm to the world, not the American people.
Right.
The American people need that as part of their salvation, if you will, and movement into the next phase of life beyond what we're doing now. So unpacking and reestablishing the correct history of what took place is very important. I think the second thing we have to do is that if we're going to trust institutions, whether they be the Republic's institutions or a different form of government institution, we need to understand what those institutions that we gave the power to in the past actually were capable of doing, how they did it, and what the limitations were that we placed on people who participate in those that we need to consider reevaluating. And by this, I mean, we're not going to see term limits until we see the evil of lifelong serving in government. We're not going
Right.
to see reduced size of government until we understand what being a government employee for life means. You know, and you can go on down the list of what all these different things mean and how they got us to where we are. And so I believe from a prospective position looking forward, it's important that we go through this process now. It's difficult. It's not going to happen all at one time. And we have to realize that there are still those evil forces who got us to where we are today, still working against us. And whether we're talking about things like plane crashes, or we're talking about buildings coming down, or we're talking about fires that are being created, or we're talking about wars, we're talking about stealing of elections, whatever this may be, there is still a huge amount to unpack. And until we go back and get this unpacked and set right with our own personal history and the history of the United States and the world, we're not going to be able to move forward, I believe, in the way that we need to, in the way that God intended us to move forward.
Well, and that's just a gorgeous way of saying it. I mean, I think about people, even if we've taken care of the deep state on an overall basis, I mean, even if we only have the vestiges, my problem is the people that, the people underneath it. I mean, I will say, one of the employees that we had, when an employee leaves, we take over their email again because, there's all kinds of communication that comes, official communication, not against someone, but official communication so that we can kind of go, oh, crud, that's like a patient asking a question. We better answer that question. And we would know about it, right? And one of the things I noticed about this one employee that, she was listening to these really alternative, or these mainstream media conversations that just, the whole thing is orange man bad kind of thing. And there just isn't any truth. And it's for them, good people. It's for them. We need to have all of the information out there. And in essence, we need to do the hairy chest ripping off of all of it, because it's not true until we get there. So
That's correct. And until we identify, we can't right the wrongs of the past until we identify what they were, how we got into that, and what it's going to take to bring the proper peace and settlement on it. I do not believe that any American today wants to be one of those republics in the world that came to an end. We want to be the one republic that continues forward. And in order to do that, we have to get our house in order. We have to do a lot of cleaning. We have to do a lot of expunging, if you will, of the bad things that took place, try to make them right. I mean, if you follow through what Nasera identifies doing for people, that's what it's all about.
Yep.
We have to identify the wrongs and we have to make them right. And sometimes making them right are painful. Re-educating people by showing them what really took place and helping them understand that the positions they took were not the correct ones, but helping them heal is something that I believe is part of the process. And the only way we get there is through the unpacking and the realignment and trying to make things right. I believe God gave the people today who are alive the opportunity and the tools to be able to do that and make it happen. And it's going to be a process. It's not going to happen overnight. It's probably not even going to happen within 4 years. It's a long process that we have to work through. But it's a commitment we have to make to future generations that we want to get this country in the position where it needs to be so you can go forward the correct way for a long time.
Well, and so what Roger's saying, please don't get all upset because every time Roger says something like that, people get all mad. And I'm like, hey, calm down, guys. He didn't say like it's going to take 4 years to reveal. I believe that, the JFK thing is an impetus point, that flips the script off of the media and off of the government. When the in essence the roofs are off, then we can kind of go in and fix things. The fixing takes time. Okay, that's what Roger is basically saying there with that too. So
Yes,
hey,
and
thanks.
Scott, let me add one other thing
Yeah,
to that too.
sure.
When I talk about this taking time, if we look at all the different baskets out there of challenges we have, there are some baskets we can deal with in a hurry. There are others that are a little bit deeper, a little bit wider, that have more things we have to take a look at. I believe our history as a people and a better understanding of how that history got us to where we are today is something that takes a longer period of time to work through. And I also believe when we look at something like elections, we can get to elections, but we have to fix the election problems in the past. We have to identify how we're going to educate people and get them to the point of where they step up and say, you did this for a couple of years, now I want to step up and do it for a couple of years, then I'll go back to my job and somebody else can step up and do it. That's a process that's going to take us a little bit of time to work through, but if we're all in it together, we can make that happen. Time is something that's unique to humans. We live in time. We move forward and backward in time based on how we think about achieving goals, and that's what this is going to be. This is not something. I don't mean that it's going to take forever to get done. It's going to be a process that's going to move us forward and help us to get to where we need to be. In retrospect, we'll look back and say, that didn't take as long as we thought.
Right.
So anyway, thank you for that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. Like and subscribe. Hey, guys, there's a lot to unpack in here. I mean, if you haven't done some of the research on it, I will have all of those in the descriptions with that too. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.